Crimson Ranch Secrets. Emmy Dawson had spent years running the family ranch, never expecting love. But when Garrett McGraw rode onto her land, all quiet strength and dark promises, she knew she was in trouble. He smirked, tipping his hat. "You don't know it yet, sweetheart," he murmured. "But I ain't riding away without a fight." Chapter 1. A storm brewing on the horizon. The wind, a restless spirit, whipped across the vast expanse of the Dawson Ranch, carrying with it the scent of dust and the distant rumble of thunder. Emmy Dawson stood on the porch of the weathered ranch house, her gaze fixed on the horizon where bruised purple clouds were gathering, mirroring the turmoil within her. At 57, Emmy's life was etched onto her face, lines of worry around her kind, gray eyes, a determined set to her jaw, and the faint, sun-kissed wrinkles that spoke of countless hours spent under the relentless Texas sun. Her hands, calloused and strong from years of wrestling with the land, gripped the porch railing, the woodruff beneath her touch. She wore a simple, faded blue dress, practical and worn, a testament to a life devoid of frills and frivolity. Her silver-streaked brown hair, usually neatly braided, was escaping its confines, strands whipping around her face in the rising wind. She'd inherited the ranch, the Double Diamond, from her father, a man as tough and unyielding as the land itself. He taught her everything he knew: how to ride, how to rope, how to shoot, and most importantly, how to survive. He'd also taught her that love was a weakness, a distraction from the harsh realities of ranch life. A lesson she'd taken to heart, burying her own youthful dreams beneath layers of duty and responsibility. The Double Diamond was her life, her legacy, and her burden. It had been a struggle, especially in recent years. Drought had plagued the land, cattle prices had plummeted, and the bank was breathing down her neck. The neighboring ranch, the sprawling McGraw spread, owned by the formidable and some whispered, ruthless McGraw family, had been casting covetous eyes on her land for years. Old Man McGraw, Garrett's grandfather, had tried to buy her out, to pressure her out, even to steal her out, but Emmy had stood firm. She'd inherited her father's stubbornness, along with his land. Inside the house, the grandfather clock, a relic from a more genteel past, chimed the hour, its mournful sound swallowed by the growing storm. Emmy sighed, the weight of her responsibilities pressing down on her. Her younger brother, Daniel, bless his heart, was more of a dreamer than a rancher. He preferred sketching the landscape to working it, his gentle soul ill-suited to the harsh demands of this life. She loved him fiercely, protectively, and she knew she'd do anything to keep the Double Diamond afloat, for him, for her father's memory, for herself. A flash of lightning illuminated the darkening sky, followed by a deafening clap of thunder. The horses in the corral grew restless, their whinnies sharp and anxious. Emmy pushed herself away from the railing, her movements stiff with a weariness that went beyond the physical. She needed to check on the livestock to make sure everything was secure before the storm hit. As she stepped off the porch, a figure emerged from the swirling dust, riding towards the house. A man, tall and lean, silhouetted against the stormy sky. He sat his horse with an easy grace, a natural authority that made Emmy's breath catch in her throat. Even from a distance, she could sense a coiled intensity about him, a dangerous edge that both intrigued and unsettled her. He was a stranger, and strangers in this part of the country usually meant trouble. She stood her ground, her hand instinctively moving towards the rifle leaning against the wall beside the door. Her heart pounded a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs, a mixture of apprehension and something else, something she hadn't felt in years, a flicker of awareness, a stirring of something long dormant. The wind whipped around her, plastering her dress to her body, and she felt strangely exposed, vulnerable, despite the rifle within reach. He reined in his horse a few yards from the porch, the animal a magnificent chestnut stallion, its coat gleaming even in the fading light. The man dismounted, his movements fluid and controlled, and Emmy found herself studying him, taking in the details with a keenness that surprised her. He was younger than she'd first thought, maybe early 40s, with a ruggedly handsome face, weathered and tanned, framed by dark, wind-tossed hair. His eyes, the color of the stormy sky, met hers, and a jolt of something akin to electricity passed between them. He wore a worn leather jacket, denim jeans that hugged his lean hips, and dusty boots that spoke of long miles traveled. A gun belt was slung low on his waist, the holster worn and familiar. He didn't look like a rancher, not entirely. There was a hardness about him, a hint of something untamed, that suggested a life lived on the edge. He tipped his hat, a gesture that was both polite and faintly mocking, and a slow smile curved his lips. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, his voice a low, resonant drawl that sent a shiver down Emmy's spine. "Name's Garrett McGraw." The name hit her like a physical blow. McGraw. The enemy. The family that had been a thorn in her side for years. But this wasn't Old Man McGraw, or his equally unpleasant sons. This was someone new, someone she didn't know, and the intensity of his gaze made her forget, for a moment, the generations of animosity that separated their families. "Emmeline Dawson," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the tremor in her hands. "This is my land. You're trespassing." His smile widened, a flash of white teeth against his tan skin. "Ire con iam, ma'am." "But I had a reason. I saw the storm coming, and I saw your cattle scattered. Thought you might need a hand." His words were unexpected, his offer of help even more so. Emmy narrowed her eyes, suspicion warring with a grudging respect. She didn't trust him, not for a moment. But she also couldn't deny the truth in his words. The cattle were scattered, and she could use another hand. "I can manage," she said, her voice tight with pride. He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the very air around them. "Maybe you can, ma'am. But you don't have to. Not today." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in her worn dress, her tired posture, the stubborn set of her jaw. "You look like you've been carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders, Miss Dawson. Let me help you lighten the load, just for night." His words, so simple, so direct, struck a chord deep within her. She was tired, bone-tired, and the thought of sharing the burden, even with a McGraw, was strangely tempting. But she couldn't afford to be weak, not now, not ever. She had too much to lose. Another flash of lightning illuminated the sky, and the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. The storm was upon them, and with it, a choice. Trust a stranger, a McGraw, or face the storm alone. Emmy looked at Garrett McGraw, at his strong, weathered face, his steady gaze, and the hint of something hidden beneath the surface, something that both frightened and fascinated her. She drew a deep breath, the scent of rain and dust filling her lungs. "All right, Mr. McGraw," she said, her voice barely a whisper above the rising wind. "You can help. But don't think for a moment this changes anything between our families." He nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "I wouldn't dream of it, ma'am." He turned towards his horse, his movements swift and efficient. "Let's get those cattle rounded up before the storm breaks loose." As Emmy watched him go, she couldn't shake the feeling that the storm that was brewing outside was nothing compared to the storm that had just arrived on her doorstep, in the form of Garrett McGraw. And she had a sinking feeling that her life, as she knew it, was about to change forever. The question was only how drastic the shift would be, and did she have the resolve to withstand the winds of change he represented. Chapter 2. The stranger's arrival. The rain came down in sheets, driven by a fierce wind that howled across the plains like a banshee. Emmy and Garrett worked side by side, their movements synchronized by a shared urgency, a silent understanding that transcended their family's feud. They rode hard, their horses sure-footed even on the slick, muddy ground, herding the scattered cattle towards the shelter of a rocky overhang. Emmy was impressed by Garrett's skill. He handled his horse with an effortless mastery, his commands sharp and precise, his body moving in perfect harmony with the animal. He was a natural horseman, a man who clearly belonged in the saddle. He worked tirelessly, his face set in a grim determination, his wet clothes plastered to his muscular frame. He didn't complain, didn't hesitate, even when a stray calf bolted, forcing him to chase it through a treacherous ravine. She found herself watching him, studying him, trying to reconcile the image of the ruthless McGraw with the man who is now working alongside her, risking his own safety to help her protect her livestock. There was a quiet strength about him, a competence that was both reassuring and unsettling. She'd spent so many years fighting against the McGraws, seeing them as the enemy, that it was difficult to accept this unexpected act of kindness. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth, wet animals, and the sharp, clean scent of the rain. Emmy's hair was plastered to her face, her clothes soaked through, but she barely noticed the discomfort. The adrenaline was pumping through her veins, the challenge of the work invigorating her, pushing back the weariness that had settled so deeply into her bones. They worked for hours, the storm raging around them, until finally, the last of the cattle were safely sheltered. They rode back towards the ranch house, the rain easing to a steady drizzle, the wind dying down to a low moan. Emmy was exhausted, but strangely exhilarated. She'd faced the storm, and she'd survived, not alone, but with the help of a man she'd been taught to hate. As they reached the barn, Garrett dismounted and helped Emmy down, his hands strong and sure on her waist. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them, standing close in the dim light of the barn, the silence broken only by the sound of their breathing and the dripping of water from the eaves. "Thank you," Emmy said, her voice hoarse from shouting over the wind. "I appreciate your help." He nodded, his gaze lingering on her face. "It was nothing, ma'am. Just doing what needed to be done." He didn't move away, and Emmy found herself unable to break the connection, held captive by the intensity of his gaze. She was acutely aware of his closeness, of the warmth radiating from his body, of the scent of leather and rain that clung to him. It was a dangerous awareness, a stirring of feelings she'd long suppressed, and it both frightened and intrigued her. "You should come inside," she said, her voice a little shaky. "Get out of those wet clothes. I can make some coffee." He hesitated, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "I don't want to impose, ma'am." "It's no imposition," Emmy insisted. "It's the least I can do. Besides," she added, a faint smile touching her lips, "I wouldn't want you catching your death of cold. My father always said a sick McGraw was a useless McGraw." He chuckled, the sound warming her from the inside out. "Your father sounds like a wise man." He paused. "Alright, Mum. I'll take you up on that offer. Coffee sounds mighty good right now." They unsaddled their horses, rubbing them down and giving them a measure of grain. Garrett worked with a quiet efficiency, his movements practiced and economical. He treated his horse with respect, with a gentle touch that belied his rugged exterior. Emmy watched him, her thoughts a jumble of confusion and curiosity. As they walked towards the house, the silence between them was no longer awkward, but rather companionable, filled with a shared experience, a mutual respect that had been forged in the crucible of the storm. Emmy found herself stealing glances at him, at the strong line of his jaw, the way his wet hair curled around his ears, the way his eyes seemed to reflect the stormy sky. Inside the house, the warmth of the fire in the hearth was a welcome relief from the chill outside. Emmy lit a lamp, the soft glow illuminating the familiar room, with its worn furniture, faded rugs, and the scent of wood smoke and old leather. It was a simple room, a comfortable room, a room that held a lifetime of memories. "Make yourself comfortable," Emmy said, gesturing towards a worn armchair by the fire. "I'll get that coffee." Garrett removed his wet jacket, hanging it on a peg by the door. He ran a hand through his damp hair, his movements unconsciously graceful. Emmy watched him, her heart beating a little faster than usual. He was a strikingly handsome man, there was no denying it. But it was more than just his physical appearance that drew her to him. It was his quiet strength, his competence, his unexpected kindness. She busied herself in the kitchen, preparing the coffee, her hands moving automatically, her mind racing. She couldn't afford to be attracted to Garrett McGraw. He was the enemy, a threat to everything she held dear. But she couldn't deny the way her body responded to his presence, the way her heart quickened when he looked at her. It was a dangerous game she was playing, and she knew it. She poured 2 mugs of coffee, the strong, rich aroma filling the kitchen. She added a splash of cream to hers, remembering that her father had always taken his black. She carried the mugs into the living room, finding Garrett standing by the window, looking out at the rain-washed landscape. "Here you go," she said, handing him a mug. He turned, his eyes meeting hers.
"Thank you, ma'am."
He took a sip of the coffee, his expression appreciative. "This is just what I needed." They stood in silence for a moment, sipping their coffee, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the gentle patter of rain against the windows. Emmy felt a strange sense of peace settle over her, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. It was a dangerous feeling, a seductive feeling, and she knew she needed to be careful. "Why did you really come here, Garrett?" she asked, her voice soft but direct. He looked at her, his expression serious. "I told you. I saw the storm coming, and I saw your cattle scattered." "And that's the only reason?" Emmy pressed, her gaze unwavering. He hesitated, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "Maybe not the only reason," he admitted, his voice low. "I've been wanting to meet you, Miss Dawson. I've heard a lot about you." "I imagine you have," Emmy said dryly. "And I imagine none of it was good." He smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a shiver down her spine.
"Not all of it," he said.
"But I like to form my own opinions. And I have to say, you're not what I expected." "And what did you expect?" Emmy asked, her curiosity piqued. "I expected a tough, hard woman, a woman who wouldn't give an inch," Garrett said, his gaze sweeping over her. "And you are that, Miss Dawson. But you're also something more. Something unexpected." His words, his gaze, made her feel exposed, vulnerable, and a wave of heat flushed through her. She looked away, her heart beating a little too fast. She needed to change the subject, to steer the conversation away from dangerous territory. "What about your family?" she asked, her voice a little unsteady. "What will they say about you helping me?" He shrugged, his expression turning serious. "My family doesn't control me, Miss Dawson. I make my own decisions." "But they want my land," Emmy said, her voice tight with anger and resentment. "They've always wanted my land." "I know," Garrett said quietly. "But I'm not my grandfather, and I'm not my father. I have my own way of doing things." His words offered a glimmer of hope, a possibility that things could be different. But Emmy knew better than to trust a McGraw. She'd learned that lesson the hard way. The silence that stretched was fraught with unspoken tension, a battle between what had always been and what might possibly be. Emmy clutched her coffee mug more tightly, the heat seeping into her chilled fingers, a small comfort in the face of the uncertain future that now lay before her. The storm outside had passed, but a new one, more subtle and perhaps more dangerous, was just beginning. Chapter 3. Whispers of the Past. The silence lingered, punctuated only by the crackling fire and the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Emmy set her empty mug on a nearby table, the ceramic clinking softly against the wood. She felt Garrett's gaze on her, steady and intense, and it made her skin prickle with a mixture of unease and a strange, unfamiliar excitement. "Your father, he was a hard man, wasn't he?" Garrett asked, his voice breaking the quiet. Emmy nodded, her gaze drifting towards the portrait that hung above the fireplace. It was a painting of her father, John Dawson, in his prime, a stern-faced man with piercing blue eyes and a jawline as rigid as the granite cliffs that bordered his land. He held a rifle in his hands, his posture radiating an unyielding strength. "He was," she replied, her voice tinged with a mixture of respect and regret. "He had to be. This land, it doesn't yield easily. It demands everything you have and more. And he taught you to be the same," Garrett observed, his voice not judgmental, but rather curious. Emmy met his gaze, her chin lifting slightly. "He taught me to survive. To protect what's mine. To never back down, no matter the odds." "And has it worked?" Garrett asked softly. "Has it made you happy?" The question caught her off guard. Happiness was a luxury she hadn't allowed herself to consider for many years. Duty, responsibility, survival, those were the things that had driven her. She looked away, her gaze falling on the worn rug beneath her feet. Happiness is a fleeting thing, Mr. McGraw, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Out here, you learn to value other things.
Strength.
Resilience. Loyalty. And love? Garrett asked, his voice even lower. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Emmy's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't spoken of love, not in that way, in years. She'd buried her own romantic dreams long ago, convinced that they were a weakness, a vulnerability she couldn't afford. Love is for dreamers, Mr. McGraw, she said, her voice tight with a pain she thought she'd long buried. And I'm not a dreamer anymore. He studied her for a moment, his eyes searching hers. Maybe you should be, he said softly. Maybe you deserve to be. His words, so unexpected, so tender, sent a wave of emotion through her. She felt a lump forming in her throat, a burning behind her eyes. She hadn't cried in years, not since her father died. She wouldn't cry now, not in front of Garrett McGraw. She turned away, walking towards the window, looking out at the night sky. The rain had stopped, and the clouds had parted, revealing a vast expanse of stars. The air was clean and fresh, the world washed anew. My mother, she was a dreamer, Emmy said, her voice soft, her thoughts drifting back to a time long past. She loved poetry and music and beautiful things. She used to tell me stories of faraway places, of knights and ladies, of love that conquered all. She paused, a faint smile touching her lips. She met my father at a dance in San Antonio. He was a rough, unrefined rancher, and she was a delicate flower from the city. Everyone said it would never work, but they fell in love. Madly, passionately in love. And what happened? Garrett asked, his voice gentle. Emmy's smile faded, replaced by a shadow of sadness.
She died.
When I was 10. Childbirth. Daniel was born, but she didn't make it. She turned back to face Garrett, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. My father, he never got over it. He blamed himself. He blamed the world. He hardened himself, closed himself off from any possibility of love, of happiness. And he raised me to be the same. She paused, her gaze meeting Garrett's. I loved my father. I respected him. But I also resented him. For taking away my mother, for stealing my dreams, for making me into someone I didn't want to be. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and vulnerable. Emmy felt exposed, naked, as if she'd revealed a part of herself she'd kept hidden for years. She expected judgment, condemnation, but Garrett's eyes held only understanding, compassion. It's not too late, Emmy, he said, his voice soft but firm. It's not too late to be the woman you want to be. To find your own happiness. He took a step closer, his presence filling the room, his warmth reaching out to her. She felt a tremor run through her, a mixture of fear and longing. She wanted to reach out to him, to touch him, to feel the strength of his arms around her. But she held back, restrained by years of habit, of fear, of the ingrained belief that love was a weakness. I don't know, she whispered, her voice shaking. I don't know if I can. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. His touch was like a spark, igniting a fire within her that she thought had long been extinguished. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, savoring the warmth, the tenderness, the sheer novelty of it. You can, Emmy, he said, his voice a low murmur against her ear. I know you can. And I want to help you. His words, his touch, broke down the last of her defenses. The tears she'd been holding back for so long finally spilled over, running down her cheeks. Garrett gathered her into his arms, holding her close, his embrace strong and comforting. She buried her face in his chest, her body shaking with sobs. He didn't say anything, just held her, stroking her hair, his presence a solid, reassuring anchor in the storm of her emotions. She cried for her mother, for her father, for the lost years, for the dreams she'd buried. She cried for the woman she'd become, and for the woman she might have been. And as she cried, She felt something shift within her, a loosening of the chains that had bound her for so long. A glimmer of hope, a flicker of possibility, began to emerge from the depths of her despair. Garrett McGraw, the enemy, the stranger, had become her unlikely savior, the one who had shown her that it wasn't too late to reclaim her life, to embrace her dreams, to find her own happiness. The past was a heavy burden, but for the first time in a long time, Emmy felt a lightening of the load, a sense that maybe, just maybe, she could finally begin to heal. The whispers of yesterday still echoed, but now a new voice joined them, a voice promising a future she hadn't dared to imagine. Chapter 4. Beneath a Sky of Secrets. The first rays of dawn painted the sky in hues of pale pink and gold, chasing away the lingering shadows of the night. Emmy awoke in her own bed, the unfamiliar weight of a heavy quilt draped over her. She'd fallen asleep in Garrett's arms, exhausted by the emotional release of the previous night. He'd carried her to her room. She vaguely remembered, his steps steady and sure, his arms strong around her. He'd laid her down gently, pulling the covers up around her, his touch lingering on her cheek for a moment before he'd left, closing the door softly behind him. She sat up, pushing the quilt aside, her body stiff and aching from the previous day's work, her mind still reeling from the emotional upheaval. She felt different. Lighter, somehow, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from her shoulders. The tears she'd shed had washed away some of the bitterness, the resentment, that had been festering inside her for years. She rose, pulling on a simple cotton dress, her movements slow and deliberate. She felt a strange sense of anticipation, a nervousness that fluttered in her stomach. She hadn't felt this way in years, not since she was a young girl, dreaming of a life beyond the ranch. She found Garrett in the kitchen, standing by the window, looking out at the sunrise. He was dressed in clean clothes, a blue shirt and denim jeans, his dark hair still damp from a wash. He turned as she entered, his eyes meeting hers, a slow smile curving his lips. "Morning, ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble that sent a shiver down her spine. "Sleep well?" "Yes," she replied, her voice a little unsteady. "Thank you." She felt a blush rising to her cheeks, remembering the intimacy of the previous night, the vulnerability she'd shown him. She was grateful for his kindness, his understanding, but she was also wary, unsure of how to navigate this new, uncharted territory. He'd made coffee, the rich aroma filling the kitchen. He poured her a mug, handing it to her, his fingers brushing hers. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through her, and she quickly stepped back, her heart beating a little faster. I appreciate you staying," she said, her voice a little breathless. "I don't know what I would have done without you last night." "It was my pleasure, Emmy," he said, his gaze holding hers. "I meant what I said. I want to help you." She looked away, her gaze falling on the steaming mug in her hands. She didn't know what to make of his words, of his intentions. She couldn't deny the attraction she felt for him, the way her body responded to his presence, but she also knew that he was a McGraw, a member of the family that had been her enemy for generations. "I need to check on the cattle," she said, changing the subject. "Make sure they're all right after the storm." "I'll go with you," Garrett offered. She hesitated, then nodded. She could use his help, and she also wanted his company. It was a dangerous admission, even to herself, but she couldn't deny the truth. They walked to the barn in silence, the morning air crisp and cool, the sky a vast, breathtaking expanse of blue. The storm had cleared the air, leaving everything fresh and clean, and Emmy felt a sense of renewal, a hope that had been long dormant. They saddled their horses, working together with an easy familiarity that surprised her. Garrett's movements were efficient and practiced, his hands gentle on the animals. He was a natural horseman, a man who clearly belonged in the saddle. They rode out to the pasture where they'd sheltered the cattle, their horses' hooves thudding softly on the damp earth. The cattle were grazing peacefully, seemingly unharmed by the storm. Emmy breathed a sigh of relief, her anxiety easing. "They look good," Garrett said, his voice calm and reassuring. "Yes," Emmy agreed. "Thank you again for everything." He turned to her, his eyes meeting hers. You don't have to keep thanking me, Emmy. I did it because I wanted to. She looked away, her heart beating a little faster. She didn't know what to say, how to respond to his honesty, his openness. She'd spent so many years guarding her heart, building walls around herself, that she'd forgotten how to be vulnerable, how to trust. They rode in silence for a while, the only sound the wind whispering through the grass, the occasional call of a bird. Emmy felt a strange sense of peace settle over her, a contentment she hadn't experienced in years. It was a dangerous feeling, a seductive feeling, and she knew she needed to be careful. What are your plans, Garrett? She asked, breaking the silence. Will you be staying around? He shrugged, his expression unreadable. I haven't decided yet. I have some business to take care of. Business? Emmy asked, her curiosity piqued. He hesitated, then nodded. My grandfather, he left some things unfinished. I need to sort them out. Emmy's heart sank. She knew what he was talking about. The McGraws' relentless pursuit of her land. She'd hoped, foolishly perhaps, that Garrett might be different, that he might not share his family's obsession with the double diamond. So you're here to finish what he started? She asked, her voice tight with disappointment. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and determination. I'm here to do what's right, Emmy, he said. For my family and for myself. His words offered little comfort. She knew what right meant to the McGraws. It meant taking what they wanted no matter the cost. She felt a familiar wave of anger and resentment wash over her, the fragile peace of the morning shattered. And what about what's right for me? She asked, her voice trembling with emotion. What about my family? My land? He reached out, his hand gently touching her arm. I haven't made any decisions yet, Emmy, he said. I want to understand the situation. I want to hear your side of the story. His touch sent a shiver through her, and she pulled away, her heart pounding. She didn't want to trust him. She couldn't afford to trust him. But she also couldn't deny the way he made her feel, the way he stirred something deep within her that she thought had long been dead. There's nothing to understand, Mr. McGraw, she said, her voice cold. Your family wants my land, and I'm not selling. It's as simple as that. She turned her horse, urging it into a gallop, leaving Garrett behind. She needed to get away from him, from his confusing words, from the dangerous attraction she felt for him. She needed to remind herself who he was, who she was, and the unbridgeable gulf that separated their families. The sky above was vast and beautiful, but beneath it, secrets and old grievances simmered, threatening to erupt and destroy the fragile hope that had begun to bloom in Emmy's heart. She rode hard, trying to outrun the turmoil within her, but she knew she couldn't escape the truth. Garrett McGraw was a threat, and she was playing with fire. Chapter 5. The Weight of Unspoken Words. Emmy spent the rest of the day avoiding Garrett, throwing herself into the endless chores of the ranch. She mended fences, checked on the water troughs, and even started cleaning out the old storage shed, a task she'd been putting off for months. Physical labor was a balm to her soul, a way to distract herself from the turmoil of her thoughts and the unsettling presence of Garrett McGraw. She knew he was watching her, his eyes following her movements, his presence a constant reminder of the unresolved tension between them. She could feel his gaze on her back, a silent pressure that made her skin prickle with awareness. She tried to ignore him, to focus on her work, but it was impossible. He was like a shadow, a persistent echo of the storm that had brought him to her doorstep. Late in the afternoon, she found herself in the small family cemetery, located on a hill overlooking the ranch. It was a peaceful spot, shaded by ancient oak trees, the air filled with the scent of wildflowers and the gentle whisper of the wind. She often came here to find solace, to connect with the spirits of her ancestors, to seek guidance from the past. She stood before her parents' graves, the simple headstones weathered and worn, the inscriptions barely legible. She traced the letters of her mother's name, a familiar ache in her heart. She'd been so young when her mother died, her memories fragmented and incomplete. She wished she could remember her mother's voice, her laughter, the feel of her embrace. "Oh, Mama," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. What am I going to do? She sank to her knees, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She felt lost, confused, torn between her duty to her family, her loyalty to her land, and the unexpected feelings that Garrett McGraw had awakened within her. She'd spent so many years building walls around her heart, protecting herself from pain, from disappointment, that she'd forgotten how to be vulnerable, how to trust. She closed her eyes, seeking guidance, seeking answers. She remembered her father's words, his warnings about the McGraws, his insistence that she never back down, never give an inch. But she also remembered her mother's gentle spirit, her belief in love, in kindness, in the possibility of forgiveness. I don't know what to do, she whispered again, her voice barely audible above the rustling of the leaves. I don't know who to trust. A shadow fell over her, and she opened her eyes, startled. Garrett stood before her, his expression somber, his eyes filled with concern. Emmy, he said softly. Are you all right? She quickly rose to her feet, brushing the dirt from her dress. She felt embarrassed, exposed, caught in a moment of vulnerability. I'm fine, she said, her voice tight. Just paying my respects. He nodded, his gaze lingering on the headstones. Your parents? Yes, she replied. My mother died when I was young. My father, he never got over it. He stepped closer, his presence a comforting warmth in the cool shade of the trees. You told me, he said, last night. She looked away, unable to meet his gaze. She remembered the intimacy of that moment, the tears she'd shed, the way he'd held her in his arms. It felt like a lifetime ago. I shouldn't have burdened you with my problems, she said, her voice low. It wasn't a burden, Emmy, he said, his voice gentle. I was glad to be there for you. She finally met his gaze, her eyes searching his. She wanted to believe him, to trust him, but the years of animosity between their families stood between them like a wall of stone. Why are you here, Garrett? She asked, her voice laced with suspicion. What do you want from me? He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I told you, I want to understand the situation. I want to know why there's so much bad blood between our families. It's simple, Emmy said, her voice hardening. Your grandfather tried to steal my land. Your father tried to steal my land. And now you're here. I'm not my grandfather, and I'm not my father, Garrett said, his voice firm. I'm my own man. And I'm not trying to steal anything from you, Emmy. I swear it. She wanted to believe him. She desperately wanted to believe him. But the weight of the past, the whispers of betrayal and distrust, were too heavy to ignore. The unspoken words, the accusations, the fears, hung between them like a thick, suffocating fog. I don't know if I can trust you, Garrett, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. I don't know if I can trust any McGraw. He reached out, his hand gently touching her arm. I know it's hard, Emmy, he said, but I'm asking you to give me a chance. To let me show you that I'm different. His touch sent a shiver through her, and she pulled away, her heart pounding. She was torn, conflicted, drawn to him by an undeniable attraction, repelled by the history that separated them. The weight of generations pressed down upon them both. I need time, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I need space. He nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. I understand, he said. I'll give you all the time and space you need. But please, Emmy, don't shut me out completely. He turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the quiet cemetery, surrounded by the ghosts of her past. She watched him go, her heart aching with a mixture of longing and regret. She knew she was pushing him away, building walls between them, but she didn't know how else to protect herself. The weight of unspoken words, of unhealed wounds, was a heavy burden to bear, and she didn't know if she had the strength to carry it alone. And yet, a tiny voice within her whispered that perhaps, with Garrett, she wouldn't have to. The cemetery stood silent, a testament to enduring love and loss, a silent witness to Emmy's internal struggle. Chapter 6. Echoes in the Canyon. The following days settled into an uneasy rhythm. Garrett kept his distance, respecting Emmy's request for space, but his presence remained a constant undercurrent in her life. He helped around the ranch, working with a quiet efficiency that was both impressive and unsettling. He mended fences, repaired equipment, and even helped Daniel with some of the heavier chores, earning a grudging respect from Emmy's younger brother. Emmy tried to avoid him, to focus on her work, but it was impossible to ignore him completely. She found herself watching him, studying him, trying to decipher the enigma that was Garrett McGraw. He was a paradox, a mixture of strength and gentleness, of ruthlessness and compassion. She couldn't reconcile the image of the ruthless McGraw with the man who treated her with such respect, such tenderness. One evening, she found herself drawn to the canyon, a deep, winding gorge that cut through the heart of her property. It was a place of wild beauty, a place where the echoes of the past seemed to linger in the air. She often came here to think, to escape the pressures of the ranch, to find a sense of peace amidst the rugged landscape. She sat on a rocky ledge, overlooking the canyon, the setting sun painting the sky in vibrant hues of orange, red, and purple. The air was still and quiet, the only sound the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. She closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of sagebrush and juniper, letting the tranquility of the place seep into her soul. She heard the crunch of boots on gravel, and her eyes snapped open. Garrett stood a few yards away, his silhouette outlined against the fiery sky. He hadn't seen her yet, and she watched him for a moment, studying his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way his hair fell across his forehead. He looked pensive, almost sad. "Garrett," she said, her voice soft but clear. He turned, his eyes meeting hers. He didn't seem surprised to see her, as if he'd known she was there all along. "Emmy," he said, his voice a low murmur. "I didn't mean to intrude." "You're not," she said, her voice surprisingly calm. "I come here often. It's peaceful." He nodded, walking towards her, stopping a few feet away. "It is," he agreed. "Beautiful." They stood in silence for a moment, looking out at the breathtaking view. The silence wasn't awkward, but rather companionable, filled with a shared appreciation for the beauty of the land. "I've been doing some research," Garrett said, breaking the silence. "Trying to understand the history between our families." Emmy tensed, her guard instantly rising. "And what have you found?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. "I found a lot of stories," Garrett said, his voice thoughtful. "A lot of accusations, a lot of hearsay, but not a lot of facts." "The facts are simple," Emmy said, her voice hardening. "Your grandfather tried to steal my land. He used every dirty trick in the book." "That's your version of the story," Garrett said quietly. "My grandfather had a different version." "Of course he did," Emmy said bitterly. "He was a liar and a cheat." "Maybe," Garrett said. "Or maybe he was just a man trying to protect his own interests, just like your father." Emmy bristled at his words. "My father was an honorable man," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "I'm not saying he wasn't," Garrett said calmly. "But he was also a stubborn man, a man who wouldn't compromise, a man who held on to grudges." Emmy felt a surge of anger, a fierce protectiveness towards her father's memory. "You have no right to talk about my father that way," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm not trying to insult him, Emmy," Garrett said, his voice softening. "I'm just trying to understand. I'm trying to find the truth." "The truth is clear," Emmy insisted. "Your family has always been after my land. That's all there is to it." Garrett sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I wish it were that simple, Emmy," he said. "But it's not. There are layers of history, of misunderstandings, of secrets." Secrets. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Emmy felt a chill run down her spine. She'd always sensed that there was more to the story, that there were things she didn't know, things that had been hidden from her. "What secrets?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Garrett hesitated, his gaze searching hers. "I don't know all of them yet," he said. "But I'm starting to piece things together. There's a story about a woman who was involved with both your father and my grandfather." Emmy's heart skipped a beat. "A woman? What woman?" She'd never heard anything about this. "What woman?" she asked again, her voice trembling with a mixture of curiosity and dread. Her name was Sarah, Garrett said. Sarah McCutcheon. She lived on a small ranch between our properties. She was beautiful, apparently. And both your father and my grandfather were in love with her. Emmy felt a wave of dizziness, her head spinning. This was a story she'd never heard, a piece of her family history that had been completely hidden from her. And what happened to her? Emmy asked, her voice barely audible. Garrett's expression was grim.
She died, he said. Young.
There were rumors. Some said it was an accident. Others said it was murder. Murder. The word echoed in the canyon, a chilling whisper from the past. Emmy felt a knot forming in her stomach, a sense of dread creeping over her. The echoes of the canyon seemed to whisper Sarah's name, a haunting melody of love, betrayal, and a past that refused to stay buried. The setting sun cast long shadows, mirroring the growing darkness in Emmy's heart as she grappled with this new, unsettling revelation. Chapter 7. A Dance of Defiance. The revelation about Sarah McCutcheon hung heavy in the air, casting a long shadow over Emmy's already complicated feelings for Garrett. She found herself simultaneously drawn to his quest for the truth and repelled by the potential implications it held for her family's legacy. The idea that her father might have been involved in something so dark, so sinister, was almost unbearable. A few days later, the nearby town of Dust Devil was holding its annual summer dance, a tradition that had continued uninterrupted for generations. Emmy usually avoided such social gatherings, preferring the solitude of the ranch, but this year, Daniel had insisted she attend. He'd been working hard, taking on more responsibility, and he argued, rightfully so, that they both deserved a break. She'd initially resisted, but Daniel's persistence, coupled with a strange, unsettling restlessness within her, finally convinced her. She found an old dress, a deep blue velvet that had belonged to her mother, tucked away in a cedar chest. It was a bit old-fashioned, but it fit her surprisingly well, and the rich fabric felt luxurious against her skin. As she prepared for the dance, she couldn't help but think of Garrett. Would he be there? She hadn't seen him much since their conversation in the canyon, and she felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. She was still wary of him, of his family, but she also couldn't deny the attraction she felt for him, the way he made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. When she and Daniel arrived at the town hall, the dance was already in full swing. The room was decorated with colorful streamers and lanterns, the air filled with the lively sound of fiddles and guitars. Couples were twirling on the dance floor, their laughter and chatter creating a festive atmosphere. Emmy felt a pang of loneliness, a sense of being an outsider looking in. She hadn't danced in years, hadn't allowed herself to indulge in such simple pleasures. She watched the other couples, their faces flushed with excitement, their movements graceful and carefree, and she felt a longing for something she couldn't quite name. Daniel, bless his heart, immediately found a partner, a pretty young woman with bright eyes and a cheerful smile. He was a natural dancer, his movements fluid and graceful, and Emmy felt a surge of pride in her brother. He deserved happiness, a life filled with joy and laughter. She was standing alone, feeling awkward and out of place, when she saw Garrett. He was leaning against a wall, watching the dancers, a faint smile on his lips. He was wearing a dark suit that fit him perfectly, accentuating his broad shoulders and lean frame. He looked devastatingly handsome. Their eyes met, and a jolt of electricity passed between them. He straightened, pushing himself away from the wall, and started walking towards her. Emmy's heart beat faster, her palms becoming sweaty. She felt a mixture of anticipation and apprehension, a familiar dance of desire and fear. "Evening, Emmy," he said, his voice a low rumble that sent a shiver down her spine. "You look beautiful." She blushed, feeling a warmth spread through her cheeks. "Thank you," she replied, her voice a little unsteady. "You look very handsome yourself." He smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made her heart skip a beat. "Care to dance?" he asked, extending his hand. She hesitated, her mind racing. She shouldn't dance with him. He was a McGraw, the enemy.
but she also wanted to.
She wanted to feel his arms around her, to move with him to the music, to forget, for a little while, the complexities of their situation. She placed her hand in his, her fingers tingling at the contact. He led her onto the dance floor, his hand firm and warm on her waist. The music was a lively waltz, and they began to move together, their steps surprisingly synchronized. Garrett was a skilled dancer, his movements smooth and confident. He held her close, but not too close, his touch respectful, but also possessive. Emmy found herself relaxing in his arms, letting the music guide her, letting herself be swept away by the moment. "I'm glad you came," Garrett said, his voice a low murmur against her ear. "I almost didn't," Emmy admitted, her voice barely a whisper.
"Why not?"
he asked, his gaze searching hers. I don't usually go to dances," she replied, her voice evasive. "You should," Garrett said. "You're a beautiful dancer." She blushed again, feeling a warmth spread through her. She hadn't felt this way in years, this lightness, this joy, this sense of being alive. It was a dangerous feeling, a seductive feeling, and she knew she needed to be careful. They danced in silence for a while, the only sound the music and the murmur of other conversations. Emmy felt a sense of connection with Garrett, a physical and emotional intimacy that both frightened and exhilarated her. She was acutely aware of his body close to hers, of the warmth of his hand on her back, of the scent of his cologne, a subtle blend of sandalwood and spice. As the music ended, she felt a pang of disappointment. She didn't want the dance to end, didn't want to break the spell that had been cast between them. But Garrett released her, his hand lingering on hers for a moment before he stepped back. "Thank you for the dance, Emmy," he said, his eyes holding hers. "Thank you," she replied, her voice a little breathless. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a mixture of desire and something else. Something that looked like regret. He was about to say something, but then he hesitated, his expression changing. She followed his gaze and saw what had caught his attention. A group of men were standing near the entrance, their faces grim, their eyes fixed on Garrett. They were McGraw's. She recognized them, cousins and uncles of Garrett's, men she'd known and distrusted for years. The music started again, a fast-paced two-step, but Emmy knew the moment was broken. The carefree atmosphere had evaporated, replaced by a tension that was palpable. Garrett's jaw tightened, his eyes hardening. He nodded to Emmy, a curt, almost formal gesture, and then turned and walked towards the other McGraws. Emmy watched him go, her heart sinking. The dance of defiance, the brief moment of connection, had ended. The reality of their situation, the weight of their family's history, had crashed down upon them, reminding her that they were on opposite sides of a deep, unbridgeable divide. The music seemed to mock her, the laughter of the other couples a painful reminder of what she couldn't have. It was a dance, yes, but one of defiance against a fate that seemed determined to keep them apart. Chapter 8. The Price of Loyalty. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Emmy watched as Garrett approached the group of McGraw men, their faces set in grim lines, their body language radiating hostility. She recognized a few of them: Silas, Garrett's uncle, a hard, unforgiving man with a reputation for violence, and two of Garrett's cousins, Jeb and Clay, both known for their quick tempers and their loyalty to the McGraw clan. She couldn't hear their conversation, but she could see the anger flashing in their eyes, the way their hands clenched into fists. Garrett stood his ground, his posture calm and controlled, but she could sense the tension in his body, the coiled energy that suggested he was ready for a fight. Daniel appeared at her side, his expression worried. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice low. "Trouble," Emmy replied, her voice tight with apprehension. McGraw trouble. She felt a surge of protectiveness towards Garrett, a strange and unsettling feeling. She knew she shouldn't care, that he was a McGraw, the enemy. But she couldn't deny the way her heart ached for him, the way she wanted to shield him from the hostility of his own family. The argument escalated, voices rising, though still not quite audible across the room. Emmy saw Silas shove Garrett, a hard, aggressive push that almost knocked him off balance. Garrett didn't retaliate, but his eyes narrowed, his jaw clenching. She couldn't stand by and watch any longer. She started walking towards them, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She didn't know what she was going to do, what she was going to say, but she couldn't let them hurt him.
Emmy, no.
Daniel hissed, grabbing her arm. Stay out of it. It's their business. It's my business too, Emmy retorted, pulling her arm free. He's on my land, and they're threatening him. She reached the group just as Silas raised his fist, ready to strike Garrett.
Stop it.
Emmy shouted, her voice ringing out across the room. Leave him alone. The men turned to her, their faces surprised, their anger momentarily forgotten. Silas lowered his fist, his eyes narrowing. This ain't your concern, Dawson, he snarled. This is family business. It's my concern when it happens on my land, Emmy retorted, her voice trembling but firm. And I won't have any violence here. You can't tell us what to do, woman, Jeb sneered. This is between us and Garrett. He's my guest, Emmy said, her chin lifting defiantly. And I won't have him threatened or harmed. Garrett looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else. Something that looked like admiration. It's all right, Emmy, he said, his voice calm but firm. I can handle this. No, you can't, Emmy insisted. They're ganging up on you. It's not fair. Fair ain't got nothing to do with it, Silas growled. This is about loyalty, about family, and what about decency? Emmy challenged. What about respect? The men shifted uncomfortably, their bravado faltering under her unwavering gaze. They were used to dealing with ranchers, with men who understood their code of violence and intimidation. They weren't used to dealing with a woman who stood up to them, who challenged their authority. Garrett stepped forward, placing himself between Emmy and the other McGraws. It's over, he said, his voice cold and hard. We're leaving. He turned to Emmy, his eyes holding hers. Thank you, he said, his voice low and sincere. She nodded, her heart still pounding. She'd stood up to them. She defended him, and she'd done it without thinking, without hesitating. It was a reckless act, a dangerous act, but she didn't regret it. Garrett turned back to his relatives, his expression grim. I'll deal with you later, he said, his voice laced with a threat that sent a chill down Emmy's spine. He took Emmy's arm, his touch gentle but firm, and led her away from the group, away from the dance, away from the town. They walked in silence, the tension slowly ebbing away, replaced by a strange mixture of relief and something else. Something that felt like a bond, a connection forged in the face of adversity. They reached the edge of town, where their horses were tethered. Garrett helped Emmy mount, his hand lingering on hers for a moment before he released her. I'm sorry you had to see that, he said, his voice filled with regret. It's not your fault, Emmy replied, her voice soft. They're their animals. He chuckled, a low, humorless sound. They're family, he said, and family is complicated. He mounted his own horse, and they rode in silence for a while, the only sound the clop of their horses' hooves on the dusty road. Emmy was acutely aware of Garrett riding beside her, his presence a comforting warmth in the cool night air. She defended him, stood up for him, and in doing so, she'd crossed a line. She'd chosen a side, and she knew there would be consequences. The price of loyalty, she realized, could be steep, and she was only just beginning to understand the true cost. The silence stretched, filled with unspoken questions and the looming weight of the choices they had both made. Chapter 9. Scars of the Heart. The ride back to the Double Diamond was filled with a heavy silence, the events of the evening hanging between Emmy and Garrett like a shroud. Emmy's mind raced, replaying the confrontation at the dance, the anger in Silas's eyes, the threat in Garrett's voice. She'd crossed a line, defied the unwritten code of the frontier, and she knew there would be repercussions. When they reached the ranch house, Garrett dismounted and helped Emmy down, his hands lingering on her waist for a moment longer than necessary. Their eyes met, and she saw a mixture of gratitude and concern in his gaze. Thank you, Emmy, he said, his voice low and sincere, for what you did back there. It was brave. It was foolish, Emmy corrected, her voice trembling slightly. "And it'll probably cost me dearly." "I won't let them hurt you," Garrett said, his voice firm. "I promise you that." She looked away, unable to meet his gaze. She wanted to believe him, to trust him, but the years of animosity between their families were a heavy burden to overcome. "You should go," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Before they come looking for you." He hesitated, his hand reaching out to touch her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, savoring the warmth, the tenderness, the sheer novelty of it. "I don't want to leave you," he said, his voice a low murmur against her ear. "You have to," she insisted, her voice shaking. "It's not safe." He sighed, his hand dropping to his side. "All right," he said. "But I'll be back. I'm not giving up on this, Emmy. On us." The word us hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Emmy's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't allowed herself to think of them as an us, not even in her wildest dreams. It was a dangerous thought, a seductive thought, and she knew she needed to be careful. He mounted his horse, his eyes holding hers for a long moment before he turned and rode away, disappearing into the darkness. Emmy watched him go, her heart aching with a mixture of longing and regret. She went inside, the house feeling empty and cold without his presence. She found Daniel asleep on the sofa, his sketchbook lying open on his chest. She gently removed the sketchbook, placing it on a nearby table, and covered him with a blanket. She went to her own room, changing out of her mother's dress, the velvet feeling heavy and constricting. She pulled on a simple cotton nightgown, the fabric soft and comforting against her skin. She sat on the edge of her bed, her mind racing. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but she knew she wouldn't be able to sleep. The events of the evening had stirred up too many emotions, too many questions. She thought of Garrett, of his kindness, his strength, his unexpected tenderness. She thought of his family, of their anger, their resentment, their determination to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs. She thought of Sarah McCutcheon, the woman who had been the catalyst for so much pain, so much conflict. She rose, walking to the window, looking out at the night sky. The moon was full, casting a silvery glow over the landscape. The air was still and quiet, the only sound the distant howl of a coyote. She remembered a story her father had told her, a story about a scar he'd received in a fight with a rival rancher. He'd shown her the scar, a long, jagged line across his forearm, and he'd told her that every scar tells a story of pain, of survival, of resilience. She looked at her own hands, calloused and worn from years of hard work. She had her own scars, not visible on her skin, but etched onto her heart. Scars of loss, of loneliness, of the burden of responsibility she'd carried for so long. She thought of Garrett's scars, the ones she couldn't see, the ones he carried within him. She sensed that he had his own stories of pain, of loss, of the weight of family expectations. She wondered if he'd ever shown his scars to anyone, if he'd ever allowed himself to be vulnerable, to be loved. She realized that she was falling in love with him, against her better judgment, against all the odds. It was a dangerous love, a forbidden love, but she couldn't deny the way he made her feel, the way he stirred something deep within her that she thought had long been dead. She was scared, and she was exhilarated. A tear rolled down her cheek, followed by another and another. She hadn't cried since the night of the storm, when Garrett had held her in his arms. She hadn't allowed herself to grieve, to mourn, to feel the pain of her losses. She sank to her knees, her body shaking with sobs. She cried for her mother, for her father, for the lost years, for the dreams she'd buried. She cried for Garrett, for the uncertain future, for the love that she knew might never be. The scars of her heart, long hidden and suppressed, were finally exposed, raw and painful, but also healing. The night held her secrets, her tears, and the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, love could conquer even the deepest wounds. She felt vulnerable, yet strangely strong, as if the tears were washing away the years of hardened resolve, revealing the woman she was always meant to be. Chapter 10. A Glimmer of Hope. The next morning, Emmy awoke to the sound of hammering coming from outside. She rose, pulling on a simple dress and stepping out onto the porch. She found Garrett repairing the corral fence, his movements efficient and practiced. He was shirtless, his back muscles rippling in the morning sun, his skin tanned and glistening with sweat. She watched him for a moment, admiring his strength, his dedication, his quiet competence. He was a man of action, a man who wasn't afraid of hard work. He was also a man who kept his promises. He'd said he wouldn't let his family hurt her, and he was here, making sure her property was secure. He sensed her presence and turned, his eyes meeting hers. A slow smile curved his lips, and Emmy felt her heart skip a beat. "Morning, Emmy," he said, his voice a low rumble that sent a shiver down her spine. "Sleep well?" "Not really," she admitted, her voice a little shaky. "I was worried."
About me?
He asked, his gaze searching hers. "About everything," she replied, her voice evasive. He nodded, understanding. "I know it's a lot to take in," he said. "But I promise you, I'll figure it out. I'll find out what really happened to Sarah McCutcheon, and I'll make sure my family understands that I'm not their enemy." Emmy looked away, her gaze falling on the fence he was repairing. She wanted to believe him, to trust him, but the years of animosity between their families were a heavy burden to overcome. "What if you can't?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What if they won't listen?" "Then I'll figure something out," he said, his voice firm. "I'm not giving up on this, Emmy. On you." She finally met his gaze, her eyes searching his. She saw a determination in his eyes, a sincerity that she couldn't ignore. She also saw something else. Something that looked like love. I don't know what to say," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. He stepped closer, his hand reaching out to touch her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, savoring the warmth, the tenderness, the sheer novelty of it. "You don't have to say anything," he said, his voice a low murmur against her ear.
Just let me be here.
"Let me help you." She opened her eyes, her gaze locking with his. She saw a vulnerability in his eyes, a need that mirrored her own. She realized that he was just as scared as she was, just as uncertain of the future. But he was also brave. He was willing to fight for what he believed in, for what he wanted. "All right," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Stay." He smiled, a slow, radiant smile that lit up his face. He leaned in, his lips brushing hers, a soft, tentative kiss that sent a jolt of electricity through her. It was a kiss of promise, a kiss of hope, a kiss that acknowledged the fragile bond that was forming between them. He pulled back, his eyes searching hers. I need to go into town," he said, his voice a little unsteady. "There are some records I need to look at, some people I need to talk to." "Be careful," Emmy said, her voice filled with concern. "Your family I know," he said, cutting her off. "But I won't let them stop me. I'll be back as soon as I can." He mounted his horse, his eyes holding hers for a long moment before he turned and rode away. Emmy watched him go, her heart filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, fraught with challenges and obstacles. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, she and Garrett could find a way to overcome the past, to build a future together. She turned and went back inside the house, a new determination filling her. She had work to do, chores to attend to, but she also had something else. Something to fight for. She had a reason to believe in the future, a reason to hope for a better tomorrow. The glimmer was faint, fragile, but it was there, a spark of light in the darkness, a promise of a love that could defy the odds. And she would nurture that spark, protect it, and do everything in her power to make it grow into a flame. She started with a simple task, cleaning the kitchen, but her mind was far away, replaying the kiss, the feel of Garrett's lips on hers, the promise in his eyes. It was a new beginning, a fresh start, and she was ready to embrace it, whatever the cost. Chapter 11. Broken Trust and Shattered Dreams. Garrett's absence stretched longer than Emmy anticipated. Hours bled into a day, and the day into two, with no word from him. The glimmer of hope that had sparked within her began to dwindle, replaced by a gnawing anxiety and the familiar, bitter taste of disappointment. She tried to focus on her work, on the endless demands of the ranch, but her mind kept returning to Garrett, to his promise, to the kiss they had shared. Had his family found him? Had they convinced him to abandon his quest for the truth, to return to their fold? Or worse, had they harmed him? The questions plagued her, feeding her fears, eroding her fragile trust. On the third day, Daniel found her in the barn, her hands idle, her gaze fixed on the empty road leading to town. He approached her cautiously, his expression filled with concern. "Emmy," he said softly, "you haven't slept in days. You're worrying yourself sick." "I can't help it, Daniel," she replied, her voice tight with emotion. "He promised he'd be back. He promised." "Maybe something came up," Daniel offered, trying to sound optimistic. "Maybe he got delayed. Or maybe he lied," Emmy said, her voice laced with bitterness. "Maybe he was just playing me all along." Daniel shook his head. "I don't believe that, Emmy. I saw the way he looked at you. He cares about you." "He's a McGraw," Emmy reminded him, her voice hardening. "They can't be trusted." "He's different, Emmy," Daniel insisted. "He's not like the others." Emmy sighed, running a hand through her hair. She wanted to believe Daniel, to believe in Garrett, but the years of distrust, of ingrained prejudice, were difficult to overcome. Later that afternoon, a rider appeared on the horizon, approaching the ranch at a fast gallop. Emmy's heart leaped with a mixture of hope and dread. Was it Garrett? Or was it someone else, someone bringing bad news? As the rider drew closer, she recognized the horse, the chestnut stallion that Garrett had ridden. But the rider wasn't Garrett. It was Silas, Garrett's uncle, his face grim, his eyes filled with a cold, hard anger. Emmy felt a chill run down her spine. This was it. The confrontation she'd been dreading. The price of her loyalty to Garrett was about to be paid. Silas reined in his horse a few yards from the porch, his gaze sweeping over Emmy, his expression disdainful. "Where is he?" he snarled, his voice harsh. "Where's who?" Emmy asked, her voice trembling but firm. "Don't play coy with me, Dawson," Silas retorted. "You know who I'm talking about. My nephew,
Garrett."
"I haven't seen him," Emmy lied, her heart pounding. She didn't know where Garrett was, but she wouldn't betray him, not to this man. Silas dismounted, his movements stiff with anger. He approached Emmy, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. "You're lying," he said, his voice low and threatening. "He was here.
He was with you."
"You've been filling his head with your lies, turning him against his own family." "I haven't done anything," Emmy insisted, her voice shaking. "He came here on his own. He wanted to know the truth about what happened between our families." "The truth?" Silas scoffed. "There's only one truth, and that's that the Dawsons have always been a thorn in our side. You stole our land, you stole our woman, and now you're trying to steal my nephew." "I stole nothing," Emmy retorted, her anger rising. "Your grandfather was the thief, the liar, the murderer." Silas's face turned red with rage. He raised his hand, as if to strike her, but then he hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "You'll regret this, Dawson," he said, his voice laced with venom. "You'll regret siding with him against your own kind." He turned and mounted his horse, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He spurred his horse into a gallop, riding away from the ranch, leaving Emmy standing alone, her heart pounding, her body trembling. She watched him go, her mind racing. Silas's words had been a threat, a clear and unmistakable warning. She knew the McGraws wouldn't let this go, that they would seek revenge. She'd put herself and Daniel in danger. She went inside the house, her legs feeling weak and unsteady. She found Daniel in the living room, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. "What did he want?" Daniel asked, his voice barely a whisper. "He was looking for Garrett," Emmy replied, her voice shaking. "He thinks I've turned him against them. What are we going to do?" Daniel asked, his voice filled with panic. I don't know, Emmy admitted, her voice breaking. I don't know. She sank into a chair, her body slumping with exhaustion and despair. She'd made a mistake, a terrible mistake. She'd trusted Garrett, she'd allowed herself to fall in love with him, and now she'd lost everything. Her dreams, her hopes, her fragile trust, all shattered by the harsh reality of the feud that had defined her life. The broken pieces lay scattered around her, like shards of glass, reflecting the pain and the loss that she felt so deeply. She was alone, vulnerable, and facing the wrath of a family that would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. The glimmer of hope was extinguished, replaced by a darkness that seemed to engulf her completely. Chapter 12. The Unforgiving Land. The following days were a blur of fear and uncertainty. Emmy and Daniel lived under a constant threat, the shadow of the McGraws looming over them like a dark cloud. They barricaded the doors and windows, keeping watch day and night, their nerves frayed, their sleep fitful and disturbed. Emmy blamed herself for their predicament. She'd been foolish, naive, to trust Garrett, to believe that he could change things, that he could bridge the gap between their families. She'd allowed her heart to rule her head, and now they were all paying the price. She tried to reach out to some of the neighboring ranchers, seeking help, seeking protection, but they were reluctant to get involved. The McGraws were a powerful family, feared and respected throughout the territory, and no one wanted to risk their wrath. Emmy felt isolated, alone, abandoned by everyone she thought she could count on. The unforgiving land, which had once been her sanctuary, now seemed to mock her, a constant reminder of her vulnerability, her helplessness. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting long, ominous shadows across the plains, a group of riders approached the ranch. Emmy's heart leaped into her throat. She recognized Silas, Jeb, and Clay, along with several other McGraw men, their faces grim, their intentions clear. She grabbed the rifle from beside the door, her hands trembling, her heart pounding. She knew this was it, the final confrontation. She was outnumbered, outgunned, but she wouldn't go down without a fight. Daniel stood beside her, his face pale but determined. He held a shotgun, his hands shaking, but his eyes filled with a fierce loyalty. "We'll face them together, Emmy," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "No, Daniel," Emmy said, her voice choked with emotion. "You stay inside. This is my fight." "It's our fight," Daniel insisted. "We're Dawson's. We stand together." Emmy felt a surge of love for her brother, a fierce protectiveness that overwhelmed her fear. She nodded, her eyes meeting his. "All right," she said. "Together." They stepped out onto the porch, their weapons raised, their bodies tense and ready. The McGraws reined in their horses a few yards away, their faces dark and menacing. "We've come for what's ours, Dawson," Silas snarled, his voice harsh. "You'll get nothing from me," Emmy retorted, her voice trembling but firm. "We'll see about that," Silas said, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. He dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate. The other McGraws followed suit, their eyes fixed on Emmy and Daniel, their expressions filled with hostility. "Where's Garrett?" Silas demanded, his voice low and threatening. "I don't know," Emmy replied, her voice shaking. "And even if I did, I wouldn't tell you." Silas chuckled, a cold, humorless sound. "You're protecting him," he said. "A McGraw. You've betrayed your own kind." "He's not my enemy," Emmy said, her voice rising. "He's the only one who's been honest with me, the only one who's treated me with respect." "Respect?" Silas scoffed. "He's been playing you, woman. He's been using you to get what he wants." "That's not true," Emmy insisted, her voice shaking with emotion. "He cares about me." Silas laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that sent a chill down Emmy's spine. "He cares about your land," he said. "That's all he cares about." Emmy felt a wave of doubt, a flicker of uncertainty. Was Silas right? Had Garrett been lying to her all along? Had he been using her to get his hands on the double diamond? She looked at Daniel, his face pale and frightened, and she felt a surge of anger, a fierce determination to protect him, to protect their home. "Get off my land," she said, her voice trembling with rage. Before I shoot you where you stand. Silas's eyes narrowed. He took a step closer, his hand moving towards his gun. You wouldn't dare, he said, his voice low and menacing. Emmy raised her rifle, her finger tightening on the trigger. She was ready to shoot, ready to defend her home, her family, even if it meant taking a life. The unforgiving land seemed to hold its breath, the silence broken only by the pounding of her heart. She was a Dawson, and she would not back down. She was prepared to fight for what was hers, even if it meant facing the consequences alone. The vast, empty landscape seemed to amplify her isolation, her vulnerability, but also her unwavering resolve. Chapter 13. Shadows of Doubt. Just as Emmy steeled herself to pull the trigger, a voice rang out, cutting through the tense silence. Silas.
Stop this.
It was Garrett. He rode into the clearing, his horse lathered and panting, his face grim and determined. He positioned himself between Emmy and the other McGraws, his body a shield, his presence a defiant challenge. Emmy's heart leaped with a mixture of relief and something else. A flicker of hope, rekindled by his sudden appearance. But the relief was quickly followed by a wave of confusion, of uncertainty. Why had he come back? What was he going to do? Garrett, Silas snarled, his voice filled with anger and betrayal.
You've made your choice then.
You stand with her against your own family. I stand for what's right, Garrett retorted, his voice calm but firm. And this is not right. She's a Dawson, Jeb shouted, his voice filled with hatred. She's the enemy. She's not the enemy, Garrett said, his eyes fixed on Silas. She's the woman I love. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Emmy's heart skipped a beat. She looked at Garrett, her eyes searching his. Was it true? Did he really love her? Or was this just another lie, another manipulation? Silas laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. Love? He scoffed. You've gone soft, boy. You've let a woman cloud your judgment. My judgment is clear, Garrett said, his voice unwavering. I know what I want, and I know what I'm going to do. He turned to Emmy, his eyes filled with a tenderness that she'd never seen before. I'm sorry, Emmy, he said, his voice low and sincere. For everything. For putting you in danger. For doubting you. For not being here when you needed me. Where were you? Emmy asked, her voice trembling with emotion. I was looking for answers, Garrett replied. And I found them. I found proof that my grandfather he was responsible for Sarah McCutcheon's death. He killed her, and he framed your father. Emmy gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. This was the truth she'd been seeking, the truth that had been hidden for so long. But it was a truth that came at a terrible price. Silas's face turned pale. You're lying, he said, his voice shaking. You have no proof. I do, Garrett said, his voice firm. I found letters, hidden in my grandfather's old trunk. Letters between him and Sarah, letters that prove their affair, letters that prove his guilt. He pulled a stack of papers from his saddlebag, holding them up for everyone to see. I also found a witness, he said. An old woman, who lived near Sarah McCutcheon. She saw my grandfather leaving Sarah's ranch the night she died. She was afraid to come forward, afraid of my grandfather, but she's willing to testify now. Silas stared at the letters, his face contorted with rage and disbelief. He knew he was beaten. The truth had been revealed, and his family's legacy of lies and deceit had been exposed. You traitor, he stammered, his voice choked with emotion. I'm no traitor, Garrett said, his voice cold and hard. I'm a man of honor, and I will not stand by and let my family continue to live a lie. He turned to Emmy, his eyes softening. I love you, Emmy, he said again, his voice filled with a sincerity that she couldn't deny. And I want to spend the rest of my life with you if you'll have me. Emmy's heart overflowed with emotion. She'd doubted him, she'd feared him, but he'd proven himself to be a man of integrity, a man of courage, a man who was willing to defy his own family for the sake of the truth, for the sake of their love. I love you too, Garrett, she whispered, her voice choked with tears. The other McGraws stood in stunned silence, their anger and hatred replaced by a mixture of shame and disbelief. They'd been living a lie for so long, blinded by their loyalty to a man who had been a murderer and a liar. Garrett turned back to Silas, his expression firm.
"It's over," he said.
"The feud is over. I'm claiming my inheritance, and I'm staying here, with Emmy." Silas looked at Garrett, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and respect. He knew he couldn't fight him, not anymore. He'd lost. He turned and mounted his horse, his movements slow and defeated. The other McGraws followed suit, their heads hung low, their spirits broken. They rode away from the ranch, leaving Garrett and Emmy alone, standing together in the fading light. The shadows of doubt, cast by years of lies and betrayal, were finally receding, replaced by the warm glow of truth and the promise of a new beginning. But the landscape, though beautiful in the twilight, bore witness to the scars of the past, reminders of the price they had both paid for this moment of fragile peace. Chapter 14. A Reckoning at Dusk. The silence that followed the McGraws' departure was profound, broken only by the gentle breeze rustling through the grass and the distant call of a night bird. Emmy and Garrett stood facing each other, the space between them charged with unspoken emotions, relief, joy, disbelief, and a lingering trace of the fear that had gripped them just moments before. Garrett reached out, taking Emmy's hands in his. His touch was warm and reassuring, a tangible connection that anchored her to the present, to the reality of his presence, his love. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice soft, his eyes searching hers. Emmy nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "Yes," she whispered. "Now that you're here." He squeezed her hands gently, his gaze holding hers. "I meant what I said, Emmy," he said. "I love you, and I'm not going anywhere." Tears welled up in Emmy's eyes, tears of relief, of joy, of a love that had blossomed in the midst of adversity, against all the odds. She leaned into him, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I love you too, Garrett," she said, her voice muffled against his shirt. "I was so scared I thought I'd lost you." He wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, his embrace strong and comforting. "You'll never lose me, Emmy," he said. "I promise you that." They stood there for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms, the silence a soothing balm to their frayed nerves. The setting sun cast a golden glow over the landscape, painting the sky in hues of orange, pink, and purple. It was a beautiful, breathtaking sight, a stark contrast to the darkness that had threatened to engulf them. "What will happen now?" Emmy asked, her voice barely a whisper. "With your family?" Garrett sighed, his hand stroking her hair. "I don't know," he admitted. "There will be consequences. They won't forgive me easily, if ever. But you have the proof," Emmy said. "The letters, the witness." "Yes," Garrett said. "And I'll use it if I have to. I'll clear your father's name, and I'll expose my grandfather's crimes." "It won't be easy," Emmy said, her voice filled with concern. "I know," Garrett said. "But I'm not afraid. Not anymore. I have you, and that's all that matters." He tilted her chin up, his eyes meeting hers. He leaned in, his lips brushing hers, a soft, tender kiss that sealed their love, their commitment, their shared future. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate, more intense, a release of all the pent-up emotions, the fear, the uncertainty, the longing. They clung to each other, their bodies molding together, their hearts beating as one. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, they knew that their journey was far from over. There would be challenges ahead, obstacles to overcome, but they would face them together, united by their love, their courage, their unwavering commitment to each other. They walked back towards the ranch house, hand in hand, their silhouettes outlined against the darkening sky. The reckoning at dusk had been a turning point, a moment of truth that had shattered the lies of the past and opened the door to a new future. A future where love, not hate, would define their lives. Inside the house, they found Daniel waiting for them, his face etched with worry. He rushed towards them, his eyes wide with relief. "Are you both all right?" he asked, his voice shaking. "We're fine, Daniel," Emmy said, smiling. "Better than fine." She introduced Garrett to Daniel properly, not as a McGraw, not as an enemy, but as the man she loved, the man who had saved them. Daniel, initially hesitant, soon warmed to Garrett, recognizing the sincerity in his eyes, the genuine affection he had for Emmy. They sat down together, sharing a simple meal, the atmosphere filled with a sense of peace, of hope, of a new beginning. Garrett told them about his discovery, about the letters and the witness, about his confrontation with his family. "It's over, Daniel," Emmy said, her eyes shining. "The feud is over." Daniel smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached his eyes. That's wonderful, Emmy," he said. "I'm so happy for you both." As they talked, planned, and dreamed of a future free from the shadows of the past, a sense of closure settled over them. The reckoning had been painful, but it had also been necessary, paving the way for a future where love and forgiveness could triumph over hatred and resentment. The dusk had brought a reckoning, yes, but it had also brought the promise of a brighter dawn. The air was filled with a quiet joy, a sense of anticipation for the days to come, days that would be filled with the hard work of rebuilding, but also with the sweet reward of shared love and a future finally free from the burdens of the past. Chapter 15. The Heart's Rebellion. The days following the confrontation with the McGraws were filled with a cautious optimism. Garrett stayed at the Double Diamond, working alongside Emmy and Daniel, helping to repair the damage caused by years of neglect and the recent threats. He proved himself to be a tireless worker, his hands skilled and strong, his dedication unwavering. He was also a gentle and loving companion, his presence a constant source of comfort and strength for Emmy. Their relationship deepened, blossoming in the fertile ground of shared adversity and mutual respect. They spent hours talking, sharing their hopes and dreams, their fears and vulnerabilities. They explored the ranch together, riding side by side, discovering hidden corners of beauty, forging a connection that went beyond the physical, a bond that was rooted in the very soil of the land they both loved. But the shadow of the McGraws still lingered, a constant reminder of the unresolved conflict, the potential for future trouble. Garrett knew he needed to take action, to clear John Dawson's name and expose his grandfather's crimes. He spent hours poring over the letters he'd found, meticulously documenting the evidence, preparing for the inevitable confrontation with the authorities. One morning, he rode into town, determined to present his findings to the sheriff, a man named Bartlett, who had a reputation for being fair and impartial, although some whispered he was in the McGraw's pocket. Emmy wanted to go with him, but Garrett insisted she stay at the ranch, out of harm's way. He promised he'd be back as soon as possible. Emmy watched him go, her heart filled with a mixture of pride and apprehension. She admired his courage, his determination to do what was right, but she also feared for his safety. The McGraws were a powerful family, and they wouldn't take kindly to having their secrets exposed. She spent the day in a state of restless anxiety, unable to focus on her work. She paced the porch, her eyes constantly scanning the road, waiting for Garrett's return. Daniel tried to reassure her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As the hours passed, her anxiety grew, turning into a gnawing fear. The sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, but Emmy found no beauty in the spectacle. Her heart was heavy with dread. She decided she couldn't wait any longer. She saddled her horse, ignoring Daniel's protests, and rode towards town, her heart pounding with every beat of her horse's hooves. She had to know what had happened to Garrett. She had to be there for him, no matter the risk. As she approached the town, she saw a crowd gathered outside the sheriff's office. Her blood ran cold. She urged her horse forward, pushing her way through the crowd, her eyes searching for Garrett. She saw him then, standing in the center of the crowd, his face bruised and bloodied, his clothes torn. He was surrounded by several men, including Silas and Jeb McGraw, their faces contorted with anger. Sheriff Bartlett stood nearby, his expression impassive. Emmy's heart sank. She knew instantly what had happened. Garrett had presented his evidence, and the McGraws had retaliated, using their influence to turn the sheriff against him. "Garrett!" she cried, pushing her way towards him. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. He tried to smile, but it was a weak, pained grimace. "Emmy," he said, his voice hoarse. "I told you to stay away." "I couldn't," she replied, her voice trembling with emotion. "I had to come." Silas stepped forward, his face twisted with rage. "This is your doing, Dawson," he snarled. "You've poisoned his mind, turned him against his own family." "He turned against you because you're liars and murderers," Emmy retorted, her voice shaking but firm. Sheriff Bartlett stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun. "That's enough, Miss Dawson," he said. "I'm arresting Garrett McGraw for disturbing the peace and making false accusations." "False accusations?" Emmy exclaimed, her voice filled with disbelief. "He has proof. He has letters, a witness." "The letters are forgeries," Bartlett said, his voice flat. "And the witness, she's recanted her story. She says she was coerced by Garrett." Emmy felt a wave of despair wash over her. She knew they were lying, that they'd used their power and influence to silence the truth. But she also knew she couldn't fight them, not here, not now. "You can't do this," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "He's innocent." "He's a McGraw," Bartlett said, his voice cold. "And he's going to jail." Two deputies stepped forward, grabbing Garrett's arms, restraining him. He didn't resist, his head hung low, his spirit broken. Emmy's heart rebelled against the injustice, the cruelty, the blatant disregard for the truth. She couldn't stand by and watch them take him away. She had to do something, anything. She looked at Garrett, her eyes filled with a fierce determination. "I won't let them do this to you," she said, her voice ringing out across the crowd. "I'll fight for you, Garrett. I'll fight for us." Her heart, once constrained by duty and fear, was now in full rebellion, fueled by love and a burning desire for justice. She didn't know how she would do it, but she would find a way to clear his name, to expose the McGraws' lies, to win their freedom. The love that had blossomed between them was now a force to be reckoned with, a power that would not be denied. She would challenge the corrupt system, the ingrained prejudices, the very fabric of the frontier society that had conspired against them. Chapter 16. Where the River Bends. Emmy spent the next few days in a whirlwind of activity, driven by a fierce determination to free Garrett and expose the truth. She rode from ranch to ranch, seeking help, seeking allies, but she found little support. The McGraws' influence was far-reaching, their power deeply entrenched in the fabric of the community. Fear and self-preservation kept most people from siding with her, from risking the wrath of the powerful family. She returned to the Double Diamond, frustrated and discouraged, but not defeated. She knew she couldn't rely on others, she had to find a way to fight this battle on her own. She had Daniel, of course, his loyalty unwavering, his support a constant source of strength, but he was young and inexperienced, ill-equipped to deal with the ruthless McGraws. She remembered the letters, the proof that Garrett had found, the evidence that Sheriff Bartlett had dismissed as forgeries. She knew they were genuine, and she knew they were the key to unlocking the truth. She spent hours poring over the letters, studying every detail, every word, searching for something, anything, that could help her prove their authenticity. She noticed a small, almost imperceptible detail, a watermark on the paper, a unique symbol that identified the manufacturer. She realized that if she could trace the watermark, if she could find out where the paper had come from, she could prove that the letters were genuine, that they had been written during the time period Garrett claimed. She knew it wouldn't be easy. The paper was old, the watermark faded, and she had no idea where to start her search.
But she was determined to try.
She decided to travel to San Antonio, the nearest large city, where she hoped to find someone who could help her identify the watermark. It was a long and arduous journey, but she was prepared to make it, for Garrett, for their future. She left Daniel in charge of the ranch, instructing him to be careful, to stay out of sight. She knew she was taking a risk, leaving him alone, but she had no other choice. The journey to San Antonio was long and tiring, the landscape harsh and unforgiving. Emmy rode for days, sleeping under the stars, her body aching, her spirit weary, but her determination unwavering. She finally reached San Antonio, a bustling city filled with noise and activity, a stark contrast to the quiet solitude of the ranch. She felt lost and overwhelmed, but she pressed on, driven by her love for Garrett, her burning desire for justice. She spent days searching for someone who could help her, visiting stationers, printers, anyone who might have knowledge of old paper and watermarks. She encountered skepticism, indifference, even hostility, but she refused to give up. Finally, she found an old bookseller, a man named Mr. Abernathy, who had a reputation for being knowledgeable about such things. He examined the letters carefully, his eyes scrutinizing the faded watermark. "This is a rare watermark," he said, his voice thoughtful. "It belongs to a paper mill that was located near the Rio Grande, close to the border." Emmy's heart leaped with hope. The Rio Grande. That was where Sarah McCutcheon had lived, where the tragedy had occurred. "Do you know the name of the mill?" Emmy asked, her voice trembling with anticipation. "It was called the River Bend Mill," Mr. Abernathy replied. "It closed down many years ago, after a fire." The River Bend Mill. The name resonated with Emmy, a clue, a connection to the past. She knew she was on the right track. "Thank you, Mr. Abernathy," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "You've been a great help." She left the bookstore, her mind racing. She knew what she had to do. She had to travel to the Rio Grande, to the site of the old mill. She had to find someone, anyone, who could corroborate the letters, who could testify to their authenticity. It was a dangerous journey, a journey into the heart of McGraw territory, but she was prepared to make it. She had a glimmer of hope, a lead to follow, and she wouldn't rest until she had uncovered the truth, until she had freed Garrett from the clutches of his enemies. Where the river bent, secrets lay hidden, and Emmy was determined to unearth them, no matter the cost. The journey would be perilous, but she was driven by a love that was stronger than fear, a love that would not be denied. Chapter 17. A Promise in the Wind. The journey to the Rio Grande was fraught with peril. Emmy traveled alone, disguised as a young man, her hair tucked under a wide-brimmed hat, her figure concealed by loose-fitting clothes. She knew she was taking a risk, venturing into territory controlled by the McGraws, but she was driven by a fierce determination to find the truth, to free Garrett. She followed the river, the landscape changing from rolling plains to rugged hills and deep canyons. The air was hot and dry, the sun beating down mercilessly. She encountered few people, mostly travelers and traders, and she kept to herself, avoiding contact, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. After days of relentless travel, she finally reached the site of the old River Bend Mill. It was a desolate place, the ruins of the mill standing like a ghostly reminder of a bygone era. The fire had destroyed most of the structure, leaving only charred timbers and crumbling walls. Emmy searched the area, her heart sinking with each passing hour. She found no sign of life, no indication that anyone had been here for years. She was about to give up, to concede defeat, when she noticed a small, dilapidated cabin, hidden amongst a cluster of trees. She approached the cabin cautiously, her hand resting on the gun at her hip. She knocked on the door, her heart pounding. There was no answer. She pushed the door open, her senses on high alert. The cabin was small and sparsely furnished, but it was clean and well kept. A fire burned in the hearth, and a pot of stew simmered over the flames. Someone lived here. "Hello?" Emmy called out, her voice echoing in the small space. A figure emerged from a back room, an old woman, her face wrinkled and weathered, her eyes sharp and intelligent. She looked at Emmy with suspicion, her hand reaching for a rifle that leaned against the wall.
"Who are you?"
the old woman asked, her voice raspy but firm.
"What do you want?"
Emmy took a deep breath, her heart pounding. She knew this was her last chance, her only hope. "My name is Eli," Emmy said, using the alias she'd adopted for her journey. "I'm looking for information about the River Bend Mill." About Sarah McCutcheon. The old woman's eyes narrowed. What do you know about Sarah McCutcheon? She asked, her voice guarded. I know that she was murdered, Emmy replied, her voice steady. And I know that the man who killed her framed another man for the crime. The old woman studied Emmy for a long moment, her eyes searching hers. She seemed to be assessing her, weighing her words, trying to decide whether to trust her. I was there, the old woman said finally, her voice barely a whisper. I saw it all. Emmy's heart leaped with hope. This was the witness, the woman Garrett had spoken of. You saw what happened? Emmy asked, her voice trembling with anticipation. I saw old man McGraw kill her, the old woman said, her voice filled with a mixture of sadness and anger. He was a cruel man, a powerful man. He thought he could get away with anything. And you didn't come forward? Emmy asked, her voice filled with disbelief. I was afraid, the old woman said, her eyes filling with tears. He threatened me. He threatened my family. I had no choice. But you're willing to testify now? Emmy asked, her voice hopeful. Yes, the old woman said. I'm old. I have nothing left to lose. And I want justice for Sarah. For that innocent man he framed. Emmy felt a surge of relief, of gratitude. She'd found the witness, the proof she needed to free Garrett. Thank you, Emmy said, her voice choked with emotion. You don't know what this means. I think I do, the old woman said, a faint smile touching her lips. You love him, don't you? Emmy blushed, feeling a warmth spread through her cheeks. Yes, she admitted. I do. Then go, the old woman said. Go and save him. And bring that evil family to justice. Emmy spent the night in the cabin, sharing a simple meal with the old woman, listening to her stories of the past, of Sarah McCutcheon, of the River Bend Mill, of the McGraw's reign of terror. The next morning, Emmy prepared to leave, her heart filled with a renewed sense of hope, of determination. The old woman, whose name was Martha, gave her a small, leather-bound pouch. This belonged to Sarah, Martha said. Keep it safe. It's a promise of a better future. Emmy took the pouch, her fingers tracing the worn leather. She didn't know what was inside, but she knew it was important, a symbol of hope, a connection to the past. She mounted her horse, her eyes meeting Martha's. I'll be back, she said. I promise. She rode away from the cabin, leaving the old woman standing in the doorway, her silhouette outlined against the rising sun. A promise hung in the wind, a promise of justice, of freedom, of a love that would not be denied. The journey back to Dust Devil would be long and dangerous, but Emmy was ready. She had the truth on her side, and she would not rest until Garrett was free, until the McGraws were brought to justice. The river had bent, revealing its secrets, and Emmy was now the keeper of those secrets, the instrument of their reckoning. Chapter 18. Trails of Redemption. The ride back to Dust Devil was a race against time. Emmy pushed her horse hard, knowing that every moment counted. Garrett was in jail, his life in danger, and she was his only hope. She rode day and night, stopping only for brief periods to rest and water her horse, her body aching, her mind racing. She thought of Garrett, of his strength, his courage, his unwavering love. She thought of Martha, the old woman who had risked everything to help her, to reveal the truth. She thought of Sarah McCutcheon, the woman whose tragic death had set in motion a chain of events that had shaped their lives. As she rode, she opened the leather pouch that Martha had given her. Inside, she found a small, silver locket, intricately engraved with flowers and vines. She opened the locket, revealing 2 miniature portraits, one of Sarah McCutcheon, a beautiful woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, and the other of John Dawson, Emmy's father, his face younger, less hardened, a flicker of happiness in his eyes. Emmy felt a pang of sadness, a sense of loss for the love that had been stolen from her father, for the life that could have been. But she also felt a surge of determination, a fierce resolve to clear his name, to restore his honor. She reached Dust Devil, exhausted but resolute. She rode straight to the sheriff's office, her heart pounding, her hand resting on the gun at her hip. She found Sheriff Bartlett sitting at his desk, his feet propped up, a bottle of whiskey in his hand. "I'm here for Garrett McGraw," Emmy said, her voice firm and unwavering. Bartlett looked up, his eyes narrowing. "He's in jail, Miss Dawson," he said. "Where he belongs." "He's innocent," Emmy retorted. "And I have proof." She presented the letters, the ones Garrett had found, and she told Bartlett about Martha, the witness who could corroborate their authenticity. Bartlett scoffed, dismissing her claims. "You have nothing, woman," he said. "Just a bunch of lies and a crazy old woman's ramblings." "She's not crazy," Emmy insisted. "And she's telling the truth. She saw old man McGraw kill Sarah McCutcheon." "That's a lie," a voice snarled from behind her. Emmy turned and saw Silas McGraw standing in the doorway, his face twisted with rage, his hand resting on his gun. Jeb and Clay stood behind him, their expressions equally menacing. "You're not going to get away with this, Dawson," Silas said. "You're not going to destroy my family's name." "Your family's name is already destroyed," Emmy retorted. "By your grandfather's actions, by your lies, by your refusal to accept the truth." "The truth?" Silas laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. "The truth is that you're a meddling woman who's interfering in things you don't understand." "I understand enough," Emmy said, her voice shaking but firm. "I understand that you're protecting a murderer, that you're willing to let an innocent man rot in jail to cover up your family's crimes." Silas took a step closer, his hand tightening on his gun. "You're going to regret this, Dawson," he said, his voice low and threatening. "I'm not afraid of you, Silas," Emmy said, her voice unwavering. "I have the truth on my side, and I won't back down." She turned back to Sheriff Bartlett, her eyes pleading. "Please, Sheriff," she said. "Just listen to me. Just look at the evidence. Just talk to the witness." Bartlett hesitated, his eyes flickering between Emmy and Silas. He was caught between his loyalty to the McGraws, the power and influence they wielded, and his duty to uphold the law, to seek justice. Emmy saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes, a glimmer of conscience. She knew she had a chance, a slim chance, but a chance nonetheless. "I have something else," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver locket, the one Martha had given her. She opened it, revealing the portraits of Sarah McCutcheon and John Dawson. "This belonged to Sarah," Emmy said. "It proves that she and my father were in love. It proves that your grandfather had a motive to kill her." Bartlett stared at the locket, his face paling. He recognized the faces, the portraits of two people who had been at the center of a decades-old tragedy. He saw the truth in Emmy's eyes, the desperation in her voice. He looked at Silas, his expression hardening. "I want to see those letters," he said, his voice firm. "And I want to talk to that witness." Silas's face contorted with rage. "You're betraying us, Bartlett," he snarled. "You're siding with her against your own kind." "I'm siding with the truth," Bartlett retorted. "And the truth is I've been wrong. I've been protecting the wrong people." He turned to his deputies. "Release Garrett McGraw," he ordered. "And bring in Silas, Jeb, and Clay McGraw. They're under arrest." The deputies hesitated, looking at Silas, their faces filled with confusion and fear. But Bartlett's voice was firm, his authority undeniable. They obeyed, releasing Garrett and taking the McGraws into custody. Garrett emerged from his cell, his face bruised and battered, but his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and love. He looked at Emmy, his gaze holding hers. "You did it," he said, his voice hoarse. "You saved me." "We saved each other," Emmy replied, her voice choked with tears. They embraced, their bodies clinging together, their hearts beating as one. The trails of redemption had been long and arduous, but they had finally reached their destination, a place of justice, of freedom, of a love that had conquered all obstacles. The locket, a symbol of a love lost and found, rested in Emmy's hand, a tangible reminder of the journey they had taken, the sacrifices they had made, the future they would build together. They had walked separate paths that converged in this moment, forging a bond that even the harshest elements of the frontier could not break. Chapter 19. The Gathering Storm. The arrest of Silas, Jeb and Clay McGraw sent shockwaves through the small community of Dust Devil. The McGraw's reign of power and intimidation had come to an abrupt end, their legacy of lies and deceit exposed for all to see. Sheriff Bartlett, finally acting on his conscience, took swift action, gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, building a solid case against the three men. Garrett was released from jail, his name cleared, his honor restored. He and Emmy returned to the Double Diamond, their hearts filled with a mixture of relief, joy, and a lingering sense of apprehension. They knew the fight wasn't over yet. The McGraws still had allies, people who were loyal to them, who would seek revenge. They spent the next few days preparing for the inevitable backlash. They fortified the ranch house, securing the doors and windows, making sure they had enough supplies and ammunition to withstand a siege. Daniel, transformed by the recent events, stood by their side, his loyalty unwavering, his courage surprising. They also reached out to the few neighboring ranchers who had shown them kindness, seeking their support, their protection. Some agreed to help, offering their assistance, their guns if needed. Others remained hesitant, afraid of the McGraws' reach, their potential for retaliation. Emmy and Garrett worked side by side, their love for each other a source of strength, a beacon of hope in the midst of the gathering storm. They shared quiet moments together, stealing kisses, holding hands, finding solace in each other's arms. They knew their future was uncertain, their lives still in danger, but they were determined to face it together, united by their love, their commitment, their shared dream of a peaceful future. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset, Garrett took Emmy's hand, his eyes filled with a tenderness that made her heart ache. "I love you, Emmy," he said, his voice soft and sincere. "More than words can say." "I love you too, Garrett," Emmy replied, her voice choked with emotion. "More than anything in the world." He leaned in, his lips brushing hers, a soft, sweet kiss that sealed their love, their commitment, their shared destiny. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, they heard the sound of approaching riders. Emmy's heart leaped into her throat. She knew this was it, the confrontation they'd been dreading. They rose to their feet, their hands instinctively reaching for their weapons. A group of riders appeared on the horizon, their silhouettes outlined against the darkening sky. They were McGraws, and they were coming for them. "It's time," Garrett said, his voice calm but firm. "Together," Emmy replied, her voice unwavering. They stood side by side, their shoulders touching, their bodies tense and ready. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but they were not afraid. They had each other, and they had the truth on their side. The riders approached the ranch house, their faces grim, their intentions clear. They were led by a man Emmy didn't recognize, a tall, imposing figure with cold, hard eyes. "We've come for Garrett McGraw," the man said, his voice harsh and commanding. "And for the woman who betrayed our family." "Garrett is staying here," Emmy retorted, her voice ringing out across the clearing. "And I betrayed no one. I sought justice, and I found it." "Justice?" The man scoffed. "There's no justice here. Only McGraw justice." He raised his hand, signaling his men to attack. The riders spurred their horses forward, their guns drawn, their faces filled with hatred. Emmy and Garrett opened fire, their shots echoing across the land. The battle had begun, a clash of wills, a fight for survival, a struggle between love and hate, between truth and lies. The gathering storm had finally broken, unleashing its fury upon the Double Diamond, testing the strength of their love, the resilience of their spirit. The air filled with the sounds of gunfire, the shouts of men, the whinnies of horses, a chaotic symphony of violence and destruction. But amidst the chaos, Emmy and Garrett stood firm, their love a shield, their courage a weapon, their determination unwavering. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. The battle raged around them, a whirlwind of gunfire, shouts, and the thunder of hooves. Emmy and Garrett fought side by side, their movements synchronized by a shared understanding, a silent communication forged in the crucible of their love and their shared struggle. They were outnumbered, but they were not outmatched. They were fueled by a righteous anger, a fierce determination to protect their home, their love, their future. Emmy shot with a deadly accuracy, her years of experience on the ranch serving her well. She took down several of the attackers, her aim true, her resolve unwavering. Garrett fought with a controlled fury, his every shot precise, his movements economical. He was a formidable opponent, his strength and skill honed by years of living on the edge. Daniel fought bravely beside them, his initial fear replaced by a surprising courage, a fierce loyalty to his sister and the man she loved. He proved to be a valuable ally, his shots finding their mark, his presence a source of strength for Emmy and Garrett. The neighboring ranchers who had promised their support arrived, their guns blazing, their presence tipping the balance of the fight. They fought with a fierce determination, defending their neighbors, their way of life, against the tyranny of the McGraws. The battle was fierce and brutal, but slowly, gradually, the tide began to turn. The McGraws, their initial confidence shattered by the unexpected resistance, began to falter. Their numbers dwindled, their attacks becoming less coordinated, their resolve weakening. The leader of the attacking force, a man named Boone, who Emmy later learned was a distant cousin of the McGraws, fought with a desperate ferocity, his eyes filled with hatred and a thirst for revenge. He targeted Garrett, his shots coming dangerously close, his intent clear to kill the man who had brought down his family. Emmy saw the danger, the threat to Garrett's life. She reacted instinctively, placing herself between Garrett and Boone, shielding him with her own body. A shot rang out, and Emmy felt a searing pain in her shoulder. She stumbled, her vision blurring, her body going numb. "Emmy!" Garrett cried, his voice filled with anguish. He caught her as she fell, his arms wrapping around her, his face contorted with fear and pain. He saw the blood staining her shirt, the spreading crimson a stark reminder of the danger they faced, the price of their love. "I'm all right," Emmy whispered, her voice weak but firm. "Keep fighting." Garrett's heart ached with a mixture of love and terror. He couldn't lose her, not now, not after everything they'd been through. He laid her down gently, his hand pressing against her wound, trying to stem the bleeding. He turned his attention back to the battle, his eyes filled with a renewed fury, a fierce determination to protect the woman he loved. He saw Boone, his gun raised, aiming at Emmy. Garrett reacted instantly, his shot finding its mark, striking Boone in the chest. Boone crumpled to the ground, his body lifeless, his eyes staring blankly at the sky. The remaining McGraws, their leader dead, their morale shattered, lost their will to fight. They surrendered, throwing down their weapons, their faces filled with defeat. The battle was over. The final confrontation had ended. Love and truth had triumphed over hate and lies. Garrett rushed to Emmy's side, his heart pounding with fear. He knelt beside her, his hands trembling as he examined her wound. It was a serious injury, but it wasn't life-threatening. She was alive, and that was all that mattered. He gently lifted her into his arms, carrying her towards the house, his love for her a tangible force, a shield against the pain, the fear, the uncertainty. Daniel and the neighboring ranchers followed, their faces filled with relief and gratitude. They laid Emmy on her bed, tending to her wound, their hands gentle and caring. Garrett never left her side, his eyes filled with a love that transcended words, a love that had been tested by fire and had emerged stronger, more resilient. As Emmy drifted in and out of consciousness, she saw Garrett's face, his love a beacon of hope, a promise of a future filled with peace, with happiness, with a love that would last a lifetime. The horizons, once blurred by conflict and uncertainty, were now clear, stretching out before them, vast and beautiful, filled with the promise of a new dawn. The final confrontation had been a test to their hearts, their courage, their love, and they had passed the test, emerging victorious, their bond unbreakable, their future secure. Epilogue. The years that followed were a testament to the enduring power of love and forgiveness. Emmy recovered from her wound, the scar on her shoulder a permanent reminder of the battle they had fought, the price they had paid for their freedom. Garrett and Emmy were married in a simple ceremony, surrounded by the few friends and neighbors who had stood by them through the darkest of times. Daniel, no longer a dreamer but a man of action and responsibility, was Garrett's best man. The Double Diamond prospered under their joint care. Garrett, using his inheritance and his keen business sense, expanded the ranch, implementing new methods, diversifying their operations. Emmy, with her deep knowledge of the land and her unwavering dedication, ensured that the ranch remained true to its roots, a haven for both humans and animals. The McGraws who had been arrested were brought to justice, their crimes exposed, their power broken. Some were imprisoned, others fled the territory, their names forever tarnished by the legacy of their family's deceit. The feud that had divided the two families for generations finally came to an end, replaced by a fragile peace, a cautious understanding. Garrett and Emmy never forgot the past, the lessons they had learned, the sacrifices they had made. They honored the memory of John Dawson and Sarah McCutcheon, erecting a small memorial on the hill overlooking the ranch, a testament to a love that had been tragically cut short, a reminder of the enduring power of truth and forgiveness. They had children, a son and a daughter, who grew up strong and free, surrounded by love and laughter, unaware of the dark history that had once threatened to destroy their parents' lives. Emmy and Garrett taught them the importance of honesty, of integrity, of standing up for what's right, no matter the cost. As the years passed, Emmy and Garrett grew old together, their love deepening, their bond strengthening with each passing season. They watched their children grow, marry, and have children of their own, the Double Diamond becoming a legacy of love, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset, their hands clasped together, their bodies weathered by time but their spirits still vibrant, Emmy looked at Garrett, her eyes filled with a love that had transcended time, a love that had conquered all obstacles. "We did it, Garrett," she said, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "We made it." Garrett smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners, his love for her undiminished. "We did, Emmy," he replied. "We made our own horizon." The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange, pink, and purple, a breathtaking spectacle that mirrored the beauty of their love, the enduring strength of their spirit. The ranch, once a battleground, was now a sanctuary, a place of peace, of happiness, of a love that had defied the odds, a love that would last forever. They had built a life together, a legacy of love and resilience, on the very land that had once been stained with conflict. And as the stars emerged, twinkling in the vast expanse of the night sky, they knew that their journey, though long and arduous, had been worth it. They had found their happily ever after, not in a fairy tale, but in the heart of the unforgiving frontier, forged in the fires of adversity and tempered by the enduring power of love. The end.